All right, thank you everybody for showing up again. Thanks again for the opportunity. Not sure that you had much choice, but it sounds good. We're going to pick up our study of James today. We're going to tackle chapter 3, pretty much the whole chapter again. It's been about 2 weeks since we would have last talked about it. So I was thinking I'd go ahead and take a little bit of time just to again do just a little bit of review of where we've come from, and then help us get into this chapter this week. I don't know how many of you would have, or when the last time you would have read James or been involved in this chapter, but one of the things that gets often is a problem with respect to James, or has been an accusation that's been leveled against James, is that his transitions between sections are a little bit hard to follow sometimes. Sometimes as we read, it seems like he has just chunks that are sort of stuck together, and it's a little bit hard to find how an argument or how his way of thinking is progressing. And in particular, this chapter tonight, chapter 3, is one of those that in some ways, I think often is one of those where it seems like it kind of comes out of nowhere in a sense. If you remember the last time we talked, we were at the end of chapter 2, and we went through that whole section about what good is it to say you have faith and don't do anything? What if you make all these claims and then your life doesn't back it up? And so the last time we met, I gave this analogy for those that might not have been here, or those, we'll just do a little bit of refresher. But I kind of feel that this analogy is going to provide us with basically a framework for the entire book of James. We're always going to be coming back to this. I think it's a way of sort of summing up what James is getting at. And so the analogy I gave was, I had seen somebody, and there was one person over here who was, I don't know, I can't remember what it was, but they were trying to defuse a bomb or something like that, and it was on their lives were on the line, so to speak. It was dangerous, and there was one person doing that, and there was a whole group of people standing over there. And everyone over there was saying things like, you can do this. And one of the words that struck me was, they said, we trust you. And this person said, the one over here working on the bomb said, you're standing kind of far away for people that trust me, right? And you can kind of get that idea, right? If you really trust, if you think about it, if you really trust, why wouldn't you just stand right here? If you had that kind of confidence and said, hey, my life is in your hands, and it will turn out well, or whatever, you'll get this bomb, you'd stand over there. And so I'm going to suggest that actually is, in one way, that's one of the best summaries of James that you could make, is that James is suggesting, or James is going, he's been building up to, and then he's kind of going to riff on this idea that it's all well and good to stand over here and talk about how much you trust, and actually sometimes to sound really good to share all your knowledge about bomb defusal, right? Oh yeah, cut the green one, remove this and cut the green one, right? When you're standing over here out of the range, it's a lot easier just to be an expert, in a sense. To say, well, I know this, I know that, but actually going over and then putting your life on the line there. And I think that's something that James is definitely working towards. And so the way that I described the book, at least, was the idea that in chapter 1, James was basically building up the idea that when you make that step of walking from over there where you think you're safe to a certain degree, from walking from over there and then walking over to just say, yeah, I'm here with you, I trust you, I'll stand by the bomb. Chapter 1 in James, or at least chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, the point of that, I think, was James building up, in a sense, I won't say God's resume, that's a little too financial, but basically building up, yes, you can trust God. Because in that situation, in the situations in life then that James was talking about, we often need, or we often wonder, what exactly is God doing? In those situations where we feel like we would like to be over here, far away from what's happening here, our choice would be there. When God invites us, or James is basically saying, I'm inviting you to come across and stand by the bomb. And then chapter 1 sort of builds up and says, and you can trust God in that. He was giving us the way in which we can trust God. And then at the end of chapter 1, we started to see there's a theme that sort of developed with the idea of almost everything after that, we begin to see this distinction between maybe not talking, but sort of, you could put it this way, the claims that we might make and then the actions that show out in our life. So at the end of chapter 1 from verse 19 and onward, remember we saw the person that looks in the mirror and then walks away, right? There's that distinction between what one knows and what one sort of might say, and then you remember I gave the analogy of me walking away, right? In the mirror, I see an overweight, middle-aged man. When I walk away and I'm on top of the mountain with my mountain bike, I see I don't even know what you call them, but I see someone that can shred with the best of them, right? I see a 20-year-old guy with a six-pack. Like I say, why would you go with a six-pack when you can have a keg, right? I'm just a party all the time. So I see just a fit young person that can shred. And so that idea between what you tell yourself up on the mountain, right, when you're getting ready to go down on your bike, is different than what you know to be true. So there's already starting at that point, there's a distinction between kind of the things that we might tell ourselves, the things we might claim, and then what's actually being asked of us. And then I mentioned at the end of verse 20, or chapter 1, verse 26, that I think James started to throw in, and here's one of these themes that I think James has woven throughout the entire book. It's not necessarily a theme, maybe I shouldn't say a theme in the sense that you could follow it in the story, but it's a theme, it's something that's underlying that we'll see sort of intruding into James' story, into his ideas. And that is from chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. He says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God is to visit the widows and the orphans. As James pushes us to say, put your money where your mouth is, walk over and stand next to the balm, there's another aspect of this that could be problematic for us. And that is, I think he's going to suggest oftentimes that it can become very hard for us, or it can be easy for us to be complacent with what we know and what we already do with respect to God. Remember, he's talking to people who claim to trust in God, people who are Christians, right? And so he's talking to, in a sense, church people. And so I think he's going to suggest that it becomes very easy for us to go with what we know and not realize that God, and when that stepping over here by the balm is very likely going to challenge us in ways that we are not equipped or that are not going to be pleasant, things that we might not choose, all right? And so the idea that I suggested was, well, if you say, we talk about someone, James says, if you can't bridle your tongue, but notice, deceive your heart, right? There's that whole distinction again. If you're sort of talking one thing, but what's inside is not coming out, or you're not matching that with what's inside, that's a real problem. And so James just offers, put your money where your mouth is. Why don't you do some good stuff for the people that nobody cares about, that everyone else has left off? And of course, we know that widows and orphans are very high on God's list of people that he's interested in. Then chapter 2 doubled down on that even further. It's the chapter where it starts out with the idea of don't show partiality. And I just mentioned that I think partiality there it's not just James saying, oh, don't show favoritism. It's actually James giving us an example where favoritism, and I don't have time to explain it all again, but favoritism basically could cost you your livelihood. In a situation where rich people, which is the situation of these people in this history, rich people were how you got work, they were how you survived and how you sustained yourself. And so James is basically saying, look, when you say I want to stand by the balm, it could very well cost you, because God is interested in the poor people, and yet you might be tempted to sort of give your attention and give the honor to these rich people, but God has spent the Gospels. Remember Jesus in the Gospels constantly upholding God's interest in people who are poor. So then, the middle of chapter 2, James moved down to say, and also notice what happens. It isn't just partiality. When you begin to say, you know what, I'm going to shade my attention toward the rich. God has stated again and again he's interested in the poor. Guess what happens? You've actually set yourself up against God. You've actually sort of said, yeah, God, I know you talk about the poor, but in this case, I kind of need to spend some time with the rich. And so James is going to suggest that when you actually make that step, you're actually beginning to set yourself up to kind of dialogue with God and, in a sense, maybe tell him about his set of priorities, right? And so he ends by saying, and no one's going to get away from that. And so the end of that section, chapter 2, verse 13, he ends with the idea for judgment that is without mercy is For judgment is without mercy to one who has not shown mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And so the idea was, instead of setting yourself up to play lawyer for God, all right, to play God's prosecutor and kind of decide how the law should be carried out and everything, simply cast yourself on God. Cast yourself on thankfulness for the mercy that was shown to you. Instead of playing that game of lawyers and let's bring out the codes and talk about it, the idea of falling back on the fact that as mercy was shown to you, you should be showing mercy. And then let God go about deciding what kinds of decisions need to be made. And then the section that we talked about last week is fairly straightforward. Faith without works is dead. And we talked about the fact that, notice the first verse there. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith and but does not have works? So the idea of, and I doubled down on this a bit, the idea that he's talking about the claims we make. People are out there making claims. We're talking a big talk. We're over here, right, talking about how much we know about diffusing bombs and how much we trust you. But James just basically says, put your money where your mouth is and walk across and stand by the bomb. All right? And so with that said, then there's this idea of speech. And James is actually, I think James, as he begins to think about, and this is why I think my story works well, is I think James has a high focus on what you say as being a way in which, as being a primary way in which we can fall down and fail to show actually our trust in God. In other words, the things we say are really ways in which we can show that we're over here talking big talk, but not walking over here. All right, just to get an idea of that, if you were to look back, you would find that James talks about people speaking, about what we say, about be careful with our speech, watch our tongue, in basically chapter 1, verses 13, 19, verse 26. Chapter 2, verse 12 talks about the difference between what people say and how they act. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, which we'll tackle today, is all about the tongue and speech. Chapter 4, verses 11, 13, and 15. All right, so all of those verses are where James actually brings up something about talking and speaking and saying and having this opinion, things like that, which again doesn't actually, then those words, that speech doesn't line up with actually what God wants from us. All right, so I take basically chapter 2, if you, chapter 2, verse 16 then. And if one of you says to them, remember, just as an example, go in peace, be warmed and filled without giving them things they need, what good is that, right? So in that section where he was so big on going from over here to the side of the bomb, again, he uses an example of speech. Oh yeah, no clothes, you're hungry? I hope it gets better for you. Walk away, right? It's our speech that magnifies or shows that we're not maybe what's inside of us or what we're thinking is not matching with what God's actually thinking about what he wants from us. So that's going to lead in. I actually think that those verses in chapter 2, verses 14 to 26 then, are going to lead us into this chapter on the tongue. All right? And this is where many people have struggled to find the connection. Here's how I think the connection is working out. Let's look at chapter 3, verse 1. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that those who teach, or we who teach, will be judged with greater strictness. A couple things here that have been struggles in the past, and hopefully we can, hopefully I can help offer some ways of thinking about that. Number one of the struggles that I have come across and heard many people struggling with is the idea that if you're a teacher or if you go to tell someone something and you go to do whatever we call teaching, that if you make a mistake in your teaching, then you have to sort of fear the stricter judgment, right? If you go and say, I'm going to talk to you about this, and you sort of set yourself up to say, I think I can help you here, you have to be careful. And so the idea is focused on, or at least for many people, I've heard it explained this way, the idea is focused on then, if you're going to teach content, you have to be careful of your content, because if you make a mistake in your content, you'll get, there's a bigger mistake. But I think James is maybe being a little more, I would say, cultural here. All right? So in James's culture, in his day, there was a definite kind of position or office or style of being in the world that they called teachers. All right? The world was full of them. The Greek world was full of them, itinerant teachers, big name teachers. In fact, Jesus was actually a bit of an example of the kind of thing that I think James is talking about here. And I think what he's focusing on is Teachers were often people who would gather a following, all right? Remember, Jesus had his disciples. That actually was not weird in his day. It would be a little bit weird for us, although actually probably not as much now. But the idea of people sort of gathering to themselves, people who would commit to their teachings, who would commit to them and then begin to honor them. If I had to say it, I'm not making a statement here, but I actually think the closest thing we probably have, there's two of them, is probably bloggers. All right, it's going to be more, you know how bloggers, you get a following and you build up those followers and you have that kind of group of people that are your fanboys kind of a thing. I don't know if you've heard that term, but people build up, right? You build up kind of a following, something like that. Or maybe even, actually, people who build up ministries, right? A lot of the Bible teachers where you begin to have like a ministry that becomes focused around a person. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. This is not necessarily an indictment of that, but I think that's the kind of thing that James is talking to. And I think the reason that he speaks into that situation is because he's thinking more about the power that you have when you have followers, something to that effect. The power that you exert. It's not so much about the content. Obviously, he would hope that you have good content, but the idea is the power as you're someone who begins to stand up and have other people who are really listening to you, people who are really following you. And then just let me clarify, on top of that with the culture, I would say that even though I used things like bloggers and maybe people who in the Christian world at least begin to develop ministries and you have a person who's a very focal point of that ministry, it's even different in Eastern cultures. Teachers, and especially people in this time, people who are called a teacher. I experienced this in Thailand, right? If I gained the status of a teacher in Thailand, wherever I went, I was always put to the front of the room, right? It didn't matter what I taught. They didn't have to know me because I was a teacher, ajan they call it. You always go to the front of the room. You always get served first at the potluck afterwards. It was horrifying. I hated it, but you can't fight it, right? It's actually worse to fight it than otherwise. And so, but there's this idea, there's a high regard for teachers, just simply the position of a teacher. All right? And that's what I think James is aiming at here. The idea when you're in a culture where you've looked at people and you know what a teacher is, you know what it means to be in a position to have power, and also then, one of the things that was well known in this day, by and large, teachers were known to be people who said the greatest stuff and lived differently from what they said. It was almost a given, right? That in this day, it was just almost, it would have been a meme, all right? Of the fact that teachers were sort of known for being people who gathered this and exerted influence over others and really got by without ever doing what they say. A lot of teachers ended up, they went both ways, but a lot of them would end up something like maybe some of the shady preachers that we've had where the teachers would teach poverty and teach all this, and then they would teach train your body, do what's right, and then they would party all night and be back telling everybody how they needed to stay away from partying, that kind of thing. So the office of teacher, or it's not really an office, but someone who was a teacher was very, very significant. And so I think what James is doing is, rather than just simply starting in here to warn us about being a teacher, I think what he's doing is he's leading us into a very culturally significant, at this time, he's leading us into a culturally significant way in which the disparity between what you say and what you do is well known and obvious, and the consequences can be horrific. All right? And so that's then just to sort of to wrap that up then, I think when James says not many should become teachers, I think he's focusing on the way in which teachers exert power, not so much a warning that if you say anything wrong, bad things will happen to you. All right? And then so this first part, by the way, chapter 3 through basically 12, chapter 3 verse 1 through 12, is fairly straightforward. Verse 2, for we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle his whole body. Again, I think what he's saying there is, if anyone does not stumble, I think what he's basically saying is, you could translate it something like this. Hey, all of us stumble. Moving on from teachers, right? So we're thinking about teachers and saying, even these people that you've put on a pedestal, even these people that you expect to know who are wise and can give you good advice and can help you, these people that you expect to learn from and that you sort of hang on to, or that you trust in a way, actually. Trust these teachers. These people, he's now moving into the idea we all stumble in many ways, and then he talks about stumbling in what he says. So I think it's basically saying, look, if you can find someone who doesn't stumble in what they say, I'll show you somebody who's perfect. It's a hypothetical question, right? Some people have struggled. Well, if I just control it, will I be perfect? I think it's more of a rhetorical type of device saying, yeah, show me someone who can control their tongue, and I'll show you a perfect person. And then the rest of this begins to show there isn't anybody who can control their tongue, or at least it seems like there's not. He's able to bridle the whole body. If we put bits into the mouth of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies well. Again, introducing the idea of this tongue or something small exerting a high degree of control. Look at the ships also. Though they are so large, they're driven by strong winds. They're guided by a small rudder whenever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, and yet it boasts great things. Again, I don't think that when it says boasts great things, I don't think that means the tongue boasts. I think it just means, and the tongue has caused or has done or has accomplished great things. And so what are some examples of that? Or how do we think about that statement that the tongue, a small member, can accomplish, or it can get bragging rights from accomplishing a lot of stuff? How great a forest fire is set ablaze by a small fire. The tongue is this fire. It's a world of unrighteousness. And again, I think it's very straightforward. The tongue is a fire. It holds a world or a universe of unrighteousness. That's the size discrepancy. Much like a wildfire, the tongue is set among our members. It's this tiny member in here. It just kind of is there. It's not particularly exciting or important or interesting necessarily. But James is going to say, holy cow, it can pollute the whole body. It can set on fire the entire course of a life. You think about that. How many times words are what you say? Think about just even, I think this is even just bragging or the things you say that might escalate into a fight, right? If you're in a certain situation and then somebody gets shot or things like that. Just your words, or you can create enmity, especially in this day. You can create enmity with the rich people, which can end up ruining your life. All kinds of things can happen. And so the tongue can have all these great consequences. All right? The forest fire, and it says it's set on fire by hell. Basically, I think what it means is the kinds of fires that your tongue can light are the kinds of things that we associate with hell, not heaven. All right? The kinds of things, the troubles that come out are the troubles on the devil's side of the fence rather than the other side of the fence. For we know every beast, bird, reptile, and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil. That word restless there is actually the same word that we saw in chapter 1, verse 5 and 6 that says, you remember it talks about a man who's unstable like the waves? It's the same word there. It's unstable. And so I think I would translate it. Restless is fine. I translate it a little bit. It's unpredictable, right? It just goes off. It just kind of, you don't know what's going to happen, but it goes off and there's trouble for you, and then you're done. Full of deadly poison. With it, we bless our Lord and Father, and with it, we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. Cursing here, pretty much in the Bible, a curse is something by which you exert control over another person's life, not just their life, their destiny. All right? So if you remember, you curse, I would curse you with a sickness, I would curse you with, in fact, it talks about, Deuteronomy talks with God cursing Israel, or at least saying, giving a list of what they call blessings and curses. It said, if you do what I want, I'll bless you. If you don't, I'll curse you. And it's that kind of thing, having a control or having a kind of impact on someone's destiny. We're not just, this isn't cursing like, oh, you darn tootin' person, right? That kind of stuff. This is the kind of thing where you have called down bad for someone. You want their destiny to be bad. And so with it, we bless our God and Father, and we curse people made in the likeness of God, which is all of us, right? Made in the likeness of God. And then you think about the gravity of that. Who controls the destiny of that person that you're cursing? Who do you want to make the calls in that person's life, right? You certainly don't want it to be me. Some of you might do okay, but for me, you don't want it to be me. And so the idea is you have taken over then. On the one hand, we tell God, oh yes, God, we're so happy for you. And on the other hand, we take people and we want to call down on them things that are reserved for God. right? Only God has the authority, the right to make those kind of calls into people's life. And so he says, look, with this one thing, you can say good things about God, and then you go ahead and say heinous things, and basically, in a sense, you might even be usurping the authority of God, all right? And so making these judgments on people, right? And notice, I think this is important why he chooses the word cursing people, right? Because it's all right for us. Sometimes we struggle, I think as Christians, we struggle a little bit with how do we hate sin but not judge people, right? Or how do we do that? And I think a distinction here, we can actually bring it out from this, is often there's no problem with us saying, I know what God thinks. I know what God thinks about what you're doing, right? In other words, I know God's not for adultery, He's not for murder, He's not for thievery. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to incorporate, when you're thinking about other people or when you're talking to other people, you don't want to incorporate that in your speech or your attitude, I know what God's going to do with you, right? Do you see the difference? I know what God thinks about what you're doing is different from giving the, I know what God will do with you, right? You don't. You don't know that this person, the most heinous person that you're talking with, do you know that God's going to save them? You don't, right? And what if He does, right? You have just cursed them and said, I call this down on you. And behind the scenes, God is actually working with that person saying, I'm drawing you to myself. Look where you've put yourself. Right? When you offer up, I know what God's doing with you, we don't. God may or may not save them. God may or not work with them. But we don't know if He's drawing them, pushing them away, or leaving them there. And so when we take to ourselves this sort of authority, James says it doesn't make any sense and it's evil. And then, my brothers, things like this ought not to be. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening, fresh and salt water? That pretty much makes sense. And so here I think we get at the end of this, where James brings out our speech as a way of contradicting what's on the inside, or the ways in which our speech, we can say good things. Our speech leaves us over here, or maybe another way to say it, our speech says we're over here, but our hearts are still back here. So I'm back to the bomb analogy. Does that make sense? We're over here saying, oh yeah, I love it, it's great, I love it, you're doing great. God, I'm with you all the way, I want to do what you want to do, all of this stuff, and yet all God wants is for you to be right here. He doesn't need your talk. And so teaching these teachers as an example, as people that we often look up to, James is going to say, those people, or that position, I think he's offering us, that position is one of the best ways to see the ways in which your speech can contradict. Your speech can end up not bringing about what God actually wants, all right? And so this, I think, is a theme that most people have recognized from James, but we finally get it and it's made explicit. All of the verses from chapter 3, verses 9 through, let's say, 12. You can see what happens. James feels very strongly. He wants to encourage us. He's built us up to trust God, and I think we're getting a sense of actually what James is trying to communicate to us. You can't be over there and over here at the same time, right? Basically, this is binary. Trusting God is binary. You can't talk about being over there by the bomb, but stand over there. You have to be over there. And so I think that's why he doubles down, or he goes so strongly with all of these. Do you see what happens? You can't have it both ways. You can't have a spring with fresh and salt water. You can't bless God, and you can't hand everything to God and then start bossing all of your fellow humans around. You can't have a fig tree that gives olives. You can't have a grapevine that produces figs. And so James is beginning to really hit this idea. Just to give you a heads up of where we're going, right? In chapter 4, he will say, do you not realize, you adulterous people, friendship with the world is enmity with God, right? So we're introducing that black and white language here. We're getting it, James is exposing us to this idea that you can't have it both ways. If you're standing over there, it doesn't matter what you say or how much you try and convince yourself you're not over here. And so James is trying to get us to see that when we want to move over here, we have to think about what we're doing, all right? Or we have to think carefully. Back to the theme that I mentioned just a bit earlier about the idea of, I mentioned in my overview, not sometimes what we expect or the things, we sometimes feel more confident that we're doing what God wants than we should, all right? And that's something that I think James is going to hit pretty hard in the next section. I think he's actually already done it with teachers, right? Because he's expecting us, at least the audience in this day, he's expecting us to realize he's basically just told us teachers aren't anything special, right? Being good at Bible study isn't actually anything special. That's basically what he said here. Okay, you uphold these teachers, you honor them, but look at the damage they cause. Look at the way in which teachers can do everything that's demonic and against God. And so he's already introduced us to that idea, and I think he's gonna double down on that in the next section to say sometimes our expectations or what we think we know about God are not what he's looking for. He's given us a series of them. For his audience, widows and orphans would not be the first thing you think about for showing your devotion to God. For his audience, they would have every ounce of their being would have said, I need to hang out with the rich guy so I can kind of massage that relationship. God actually says, no, it's better not. And so this disparity between what we expect and what God expects is something that James is also going to start hitting. Let me just read something to you here to try and illustrate. One of the things that it might be kind of fun to do sometime after we finish this, maybe in a different kind of study, is to develop the links between James and what Jesus says, because there's a phenomenal parallel between the content of like the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' way of speaking and the ideas that James is talking about. But here's maybe just one of them. If we look at James chapter 7, verse 21 through 23. I just want to read this and ask us to think about it for a second. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, and do mighty works in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. If you saw people casting out demons and doing mighty works, what would you, in Jesus' name, what would you think about that person? Probably be impressed. I don't know. I would be impressed, right? I would be interested. This person must be really on board with God. To get a hold of that power, this person must be really in tight with God. And what does Jesus say? That's not actually what I was looking for, right? And in a sense, anybody can do that, right? Anybody can use power. What God's looking for is people who will walk from here to there. Does that make sense? He's not interested in how you use his power, although he might want you to in the sense of giving it to you to use for good. It's not that he hates that, but that doesn't, your use of this kind of power that God gives doesn't reflect what's in here, does it? And so I think that's the same kind of thing that James is talking about. We tend to gravitate towards the miracles and the powerful expressions of doing things for God. And God is asking over here, visit the widows and orphans. Make some sacrifices for poor people instead of following the rich people. Things like that. And so I think that theme that James has, that idea that we can be mistaken in what we value or what we would want to say, hey, God, look at this. See how I'm trying to serve you. We can be mistaken in those things. And so James is going to bring us along and open that up. And I think in his culture, using teachers would do that. This was a culture where people honored teachers. They looked at them as people who were in tight with God. And James has basically said, your teacherness doesn't do anything about your ability to control your speech and live out your trust or avoid causing problems. All right, let's get into the last verses and we can finish this up fairly quickly. Who is wise and understanding among you? All right, and I think this is what James is saying. I think this section is related to what's gone before. Because guess who we think is wise and understanding among us? Teachers, right? Superhero missionaries from Thailand that supposedly know a lot about the Bible, right? And James is saying it's all garbage, right? None of it matters. I'm being a little bit excessive there, but you get my point. He's asking the question then, do you actually, now that we've talked about teachers, these people who represent wisdom and understanding in your churches, now that we've talked about them and the weaknesses or the ways in which they can fail to meet what God actually wants from them, let's talk about people who are actually wise, who actually have understanding. By the way, wise and understanding, we're not going to spend a bunch of time on that. That's just a set of words that go together to mean one thing, sort of like fear and trembling in English. Right? You're not going to go, we got to know what fear is and I've got to know what trembling. Fear and trembling means you're really scared. And this is the same way. Do you want to know who's the smarty boots among you? Do you want to know who you should honor as actually having wisdom from God? So James is going to tell us. You'll tell them by their good conduct, or by this person, it's good conduct that show that he works in the meekness of wisdom. Just want to clarify that word meekness. That word is a little less, I think we have a bit of a skewed way of thinking about meekness these days. It's not, that kind of meekness. The word actually has a little more of a sense of someone who is, a better translation, or at least I think a better sense of the word, is humility. The idea of you can tell when someone who's a humble person who isn't interested in someone who's not consumed by their own self-importance. All right? So it's more like that. It's not just someone who walks around meek and mild. It's something more, someone who has seen or the humility of wisdom. And I don't know if you remember, but early on I suggested that wisdom is basically humility. It's submitting yourself to what God offers instead of what you want or what story you've written for yourself. And I think that's what he's getting to here. The person who has been able to hand over their life, essentially trust in God, that's what wisdom is, at least the kind of wisdom that James is talking about in his book. But if you have any bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, if you are beginning to look outside of yourself and you're interested in what you don't have, and you have ambition to put yourself forward, do not boast and be false to the truth. I think what he's saying there is basically this. The boasting is, I think, it's a reference to those things that we hold up as demonstrating our trust in God. It's all the things we say over here to justify ourselves instead of walking over here. All right, and so he's saying, if you have this kind of thing, if you are putting yourself forward, if you're thinking about the ambitions you have, stop going on about how wise and wonderful you are, because it's not wisdom, right? If you're someone up here that gets pretty excited about how wonderfully you're teaching, James is going to say, stop it, right? Stop. So stop going on about how much you're doing for God. Maybe another way to put it is this. Stop going on about how many demons you've cast out, how many people you healed in Jesus' name. You see how that works? Stop going on about that. Just shut up. If you're not doing, or if you have this negative trait in you, it's not wisdom. And don't be false to the truth. James is famous for talking about concepts later that he talked about earlier. And I think this is a reference to the truth. You may not remember, but in chapter 1, he said, of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth. And I suggested that was the gospel, and I'm going to suggest the same thing here, that the truth here, don't lie to the truth. It's not don't tell lies, but what it's saying is when you're all claiming, oh yeah, I healed this person and that person in Jesus' name, all of these things, if that's your focus, that's where, and you have these other things in your heart, you've accumulated all these wonderful things that supposedly God wants you to do, stop bragging about it, or stop going on about it. And then, because when you do, you're telling lies about the effect of the gospel in your life. Because God and Jesus, I think, the impact of the gospel is to make you grateful because of the work of Christ. It's to be thankful. It's to be grateful to God for His mercy. All right? And James actually has mentioned mercy a number of times. So I think the lie against the truth here, or don't be false to the truth, is simply when you're living this way that I've said is not a good way to live, you are putting the gospel to the lie. You're exhibiting something apart from what the gospel, the implications of the gospel would be in your life. So don't do that. This is not wisdom that comes down from above. Do you remember in chapter 1? You remember I said James sometimes starts to look backwards? Do you remember what he said in chapter 1, verse 17? Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. Right? So if you want to get on board with the wisdom that God's handing down from above, which is good, we've already been told by James, if you want to get on board with that, this behavior that he's talking about is not the way to do it. All right? It's not the wisdom when you're beginning to think in terms of factions, setting yourself apart from others, setting yourself against others, seeking the way that you might come out ahead, or seeking to get your own way in a sense. That's what James says. There's, let's see, sorry, I lost my place. I'm going to have to get a bigger, large text Bible here. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it's earthly, it's unspiritual, and unspiritual there, I think, isn't related to the Holy Spirit. All right? It doesn't have to be. I think it's related to the idea it doesn't take into account higher realities than what you experience on this earth. It means it's stunted. And then, of course, it's demonic. Where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. I think it makes sense. Again, jealousy is something that James is going to go on and on about at this point. The idea of dissatisfaction with where you are, the idea of dissatisfaction with the state of your life, what's happened to you, this idea of looking out at what others have and wanting that, having that be a driving force in your life. James is going to say it's nothing but problems. Disorder leads to chaos, right? If each one of us is sort of really struggling to get what we think we want, you can see how it can devolve into problems really quickly. And then every vile practice. We know envy and jealousy. In fact, the ancient writers associated with, and we'll see it later in James, he'll talk about war and murder. They associated with envy with the cause of all kinds of murderous things, all the way down to murder. You kill and everything because you want what someone else has. So James is suggesting that's not good. But my glasses are killing me. But wisdom that is from above, the good wisdom, is first pure, it's peaceable. In other words, it keeps the peace, or it's interested in harmony. It's gentle. This idea of gentle, again, is not maybe quite what we think of as gentle, like just a simple touch, but it's the idea that someone who's willing to, someone who isn't interested in always getting their own way, someone who isn't always fighting to make sure that they get what's coming to them, all right? It's someone who can step back from themselves, in a sense. Open to reason, or reasonable is probably a good way to put it. Full of mercy. Do you remember what James said in chapter 2, verse 13? For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And we'll find that idea that James, I think, is going to say again and again, as we reflect on the mercy of God to us in the gospel, that's our model of dealing with people outside of us, right? The model we've been given, the law of liberty, he called it earlier, is this idea of mercy has to play into it. The idea of not always holding everyone accountable for everything they've done. Not always giving to people what they deserve. And you can see how that would be actually a hard way for a community to live, right? If you start thinking about a church community. If you're always thinking about, you did this to me, let's see, Life's not here, but I made fun of him in a service once, right? And you could see if he doesn't forgive me for that, then now we've got problems, right? He has to extend, hopefully I did apologize to him, but at that point he still, right, extends mercy. This kind of thing where we extend to each other mercy is the only way to live together in the kind of community that James is going to talk about. Full of mercy and good fruits, impartial. Again, that's probably a better way to say that is probably undivided, meaning with a singular focus, not, I kind of want to be here, but I'd like to trust over here. We talked about that at the first chapter. It's less, it's more about that kind of division, someone who is convinced and has the focus on God that they need to. All right? And then sincere. Basically, don't be hypocritical. Don't be saying things that are insincere. There's not much other way to put that. All right? And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Basically here, the way this I think should be taken, the way I'm taking it, is that righteousness, if you want to do righteousness, that grows out of peace. All right? It's righteousness that comes out of peace. The harvest and righteousness are the same thing there. We could talk about that a little bit later, but basically, righteousness is what comes out of peace among those or by those who make peace. In other words, in the company of people who value peace. And so James is again suggesting, here's the alternate viewpoint, right? When everyone's setting themselves up to be a teacher, or when we're competing amongst ourselves, when we're always trying to outdo the next person, when we're always controlling and trying to manufacture our reputation, James is going to suggest that's not at all what God is interested in, right? And so teachers, this position of teacher, is a way of him showing how what we often would honor or be interested in is not something that God's actually interested in. God is interested in this alternate. And you know what happens? Every single person can do this, right? All of us can be peaceful. All of us can do good. All of us can be gentle. All of us can be open to reason. It's not reserved for teachers, pastors, especially pastors. Oh, no, I gotta get in those digs when I can. It's not reserved for these people or the saint that we see in the back pew, right? What God honors and what God is interested in and what in fact results in righteousness is this way of being wise in the world. It's pure, it's peaceable, it's gentle, it's open to reason, it's full of mercy, good fruits, it's undivided in its focus, and it's sincere. It's not hypocritical. I'm going to finish with a reading like I do usually, and then we'll be done. Not many of you should become teachers, my friends, because you know as well as I do that they will be judged more intensely because of it. Every one of us stumbles in all kinds of ways, and if you can show me someone who never stumbles in what they say, I'll show you a perfect person who can control their entire body as well. You get the idea. We put bits in the mouths of horses to get them to obey, and with a tiny object, we control their bodies. Or look at ships. They are all huge and driven by strong winds, yet they are steered by a tiny rudder as the pilot sees fit. Unfortunately, the tongue is the same way, but it's more dangerous because it's a small part of the body that punches way above its weight, like the tiny flame that starts a massive wildfire. The tongue is exactly like this tiny flame, with the same potential for a whole universe of evil. As a part of the body, it's pretty mundane, and yet it pollutes the whole thing. It can send a whole life down in flames, set on fire by the flames of hell itself. It's crazy. Every kind of animal and bird, reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by people, but no one can ever seem to tame the tongue. It's unpredictably evil and full of deadly poison. One moment we're honoring our Lord and Father with it, and the next we're calling down curses on those made in His very likeness. From the same mouth comes both blessing and cursing, my friends, and this shouldn't be so. Wouldn't we be shocked to see the same spring give both fresh and salt water from the same opening? Or a fig tree bearing olives? What about a grapevine producing figs? What about a saltwater pond? We would never expect to get fresh water from it, would we? Teachers can seem capable and smart, and it's easy to get caught up in that. It's easy to lose track of what God actually considers wisdom. Do you want to figure out who among you should be considered wise and understanding? It's the person whose good behavior grows out of the humility that defines wisdom. Someone who can see the bigger picture and isn't overly impressed by their own self-importance. Mean-spirited ambition and competition with others is nowhere close to wisdom. Getting sidetracked by trying to get the world to work the way you want it to work isn't wisdom. If that's where you're at, stop going on about how much you long for God's wisdom. You don't. Stop giving the lie to your claims to care about the gospel. You don't. Such a display doesn't represent anything good coming down from above. It's earthbound, it's unthinking, and ultimately demonic. Whenever you get caught up in jockeying for position, or trying to look better than others, or to get the better of others, or to force things to go your way, things will fall into chaos, and everyone ends up at each other's throats. Wisdom that actually comes from above is at its core pure, and it stands out as such. It aims for harmony rather than competition. It is reasonable and doesn't insist on always being right. It's willing to get along with others. Wisdom from above is overflowing with mercy and takes care to do what is best to promote good around them. It's not conflicted about its focus, and it is never insincere in its dealings with others. At the end of the day, the way to have a life that earns the big thumbs up from God that we all want is to work hard at getting along with others in a community of those doing the same.